before we start the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the Caribbean Actuarial Association's webpage as well as ActiveView. And the upload may include whatever you type in the chat. So by registering for this webinar and attending this session, you're giving permission to the CAA to use any text, any photograph or video taken during this event. And you'll all be muted during the webinar, but as we're going along, feel free to use the reaction button as you've done already and to share comments in the chat section. And your questions, please put them in the Q&A section below. And for those of you who haven't already registered, the CAA's annual conference is being held in Trinidad this year from November 29th to December 1st. We place a link in the chat for those of you who are interested, or you can go to CAA 2023 conference, that's all one word, .com to register. Now join me in welcoming our 4 distinguished guests, all experts in their fields and all passionate about climate change. I want to share a few words about each of them so you know why they were invited to join this discussion. Ms. Aisling Kennedy, a fellow actuary. She's a fellow of the Society of Actuaries in Ireland with over 35 years of experience in the financial services and healthcare sectors. She's an independent non-executive director of several insurance companies, and until 2020, she was the head of life and health pricing at Swiss Re. She was one of the lead authors of the International Association of Actuaries' recent paper titled The Climate Change Adaptation Gap and Actuarial Perspective. Aisling is currently working in the area of biodiversity and its intersection with climate change. Mr. Antonio Rowe is the Deputy Director of Barbados' Coastal Zone Management Unit. He's a registered professional civil engineer with over 25 years experience. His unit was responsible for the construction of 3 major coastal infrastructure projects in Barbados, including the Sir Richard Haynes Boardwalk. And this boardwalk was featured in the IAA's paper on adaptation, and you're welcome to read about it there. Mr. Rowe has also served as the Director of Barbados' Drainage Division with responsibility for the island's flood alleviation interventions and maintenance of the island's drainage infrastructure. Dr. David Bino is an agronomist, economist, and international sustainable development specialist. He currently works as the National Coordinator of the Global Environmental Facility Small Grants Program for Barbados and the OECS. His PhD focused on multi-level governance, climate change adaptation, and agri-environmental stewardship within small island developing states. He has served as a member of the United Nations Environmental Programme Scientific and Expert Review Team, which assesses emerging issues impacting small island developing states. And he currently sits on the National Climate Change Committee. Dr. Jay Campbell is an assistant lecturer in the Department of Physics at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. He is a computational physicist with a focus on atmospheric sciences, more specifically, the generation of regional climate modeling scenarios at scales relevant to the small size and complex terrain of the nations of the Caribbean. His research includes examining the impacts of climate on the key economic drivers and social sectors of the Caribbean. So thank you all very much for coming and welcome. And as we had discussed previously, our aim today is really to find out what you believe that we as Caribbean actuaries and Caribbean people should be focusing on when it comes to climate change. But before we start, let's look at what the science says. Because part of the challenge most of us who want to take some action in the area of climate change have is that we get conflicting messages in the media on the extent to which the changes in weather patterns that we are experiencing are due to climate change. So Jay, Dr. Campbell, how do we know that climate change is really happening? And could you share some of the most compelling evidence or observations that you've made highlighting the urgency of addressing climate change in our region?
All right, good evening and good afternoon, everyone. And good morning to some of you joining from other parts of the globe. And I should also say good night. So I think I've covered every bit of the day. Now, for the next 2 minutes, I'm going to treat you like my students, and I'm going to actually walk you through in a very succinct way. There are those who will tell you that climate doesn't only change because of natural forcings. Climate can change because of how can change because of volcanic eruptions. It can change because of the Earth's orbit around the sun. But there are two key telling things that will actually say to you that what we're facing now is largely due to human effects. And that is, if you examine the rate at which greenhouse gas concentrations, in particular CO2, has changed over the last 160 years between the 1800s and to today, and you try to track how temperatures have changed over that period of time as well, there is a clear, almost, you could call the two things to be in a relationship of sort, where there's a point in time where you may drift away, but you come back to the same. So as the carbon dioxide concentrations have increased, we've seen increases in temperature. Additionally, when the IPCC and other studies have actually pulled out from, they've actually tried to separate out the anthropogenic or human forcings from that, what is seen is that Earth's temperature would be much, much cooler without the effect of human beings. And so there is a clear relationship and a clear sign that what we're facing, for want of a better term, is also a new normal and is now unprecedented. To think about the Caribbean region, and we normally think about ourselves as being warm, but is there such a thing as being too warm? Is there such a thing as being too hot? Over the last 5 years, there have been several Caribbean territories that have recorded temperatures that they've never normally recorded before. And you're looking at areas where temperatures have gotten as high as 39 degrees C. When you think about that, in essence, you're thinking about a deviation in temperatures from the normal. We are supposed to be hot, but are we supposed to be that hot? We expect for 6 months of the year, there's a possibility of getting hurricanes. And within that possibility, there is also this trend that says we may get a major storm on average in the past. We may get a major storm on average once every 7 to 10 years. Now it's the case, and by major I mean category 3, 4, and 5. Now it's the case that almost every year we are expecting to see that. In essence as well, and telling evidence as well, is the mere fact that if we examine 160 years from 1860 to now, and we're looking for those warm years, where are your warm years? The last decade we faced has been the warmest decade we've ever faced. In fact, it was almost 0.4 of a degree warmer than it was before, 0.04 of a degree, sorry, warmer than it was before, going from about at 0.8 to 1.2, 1.1, 1.2, somewhere there. So we've seen a dramatic shift in global temperatures overall, and that shift in global temperatures has affected distribution of rainfall, has affected the extremes that we've been facing. So there is indeed this telling thing that we're facing, but then the question becomes, what does it impact and how should we be reacting? And should we largely just throw our hands in the air? Or are those two words that have framed the title of this webinar, key things and key actions that we should undertake, that being adaptation and mitigation, and how do the two things interplay?
Thanks. I mean, Aisling, in the paper, we talk about the 3 lines of defense. So we talk about mitigation, yes, adaptation, and loss recovery, which is where insurance comes in. So Aisling, can you speak a bit about that and then define for us mitigation and adaptation from an actuarial perspective?
Yes, thank you, Bertha. And it's interesting because mitigation is a word that we actuaries use in a different context to the way in which it's used in the climate arena. So that's important to recognize. So when we talk about mitigating risks in a risk management way, in an actuarial sense, it's a little bit different, because what we mean by mitigation of climate change is just trying to roll back the impact that we humans have had on the climate. So we need to stop emitting carbon dioxide in particular, also other greenhouse gases, and we need to find ways to actually see if we can lock up some of the emissions that we've already put into the atmosphere by means of things like carbon capture. So mitigation in a climate sense, we're trying to kind of, to some extent, to pull back from the damage we've done. Whereas when we talk about adaptation, we're talking about trying to given that the climate is changing, given that we have this warmer world that Jay has described, with more rain, more storms, more frequent severe events, we need to find a way to live with that. And we need to do both of those things, because we need to limit the damage we're causing in terms of climate change, because all of the science tells us that things are going to get worse and worse and worse if we don't. But at the same time, we need to accept that we're never going to be able to go all the way back to 1860. And some of the things, or even 1960, so some of the things that warming will result in are things that we need to face up to and adapt to, and get ready to live through. So there is a tension between mitigation and adaptation, because some of the things that we can do to mitigate climate change will also help with adaptation. And so nature restoration is usually a good example there. But given our limited resources, sometimes we have to choose what we're going to prioritize. Very simplistically, I tend to think of mitigation as really primarily the responsibility of those of us who live in countries that have historically put a lot of the emissions into the atmosphere, maybe sooner than other parts of the world, and have very carbon intensive lifestyles. We really need to be the ones who prioritize mitigation. And then on the other hand, there are many countries, including in your part of the world, where probably the primary focus needs to be on adaptation, because those climate changes are already starting to impact. Although I have to say that just this summer in Ireland, which is where I sit, we're, in spite of our very mild climate, starting to see the impact of climate change. It's really starting to be evident in our weather patterns. So everywhere is going to have to adapt to some extent. Just on the last point on the third line of defense, Bertha, just maybe one point to make. So obviously insurance has a key role to play, and we as actuaries working in the insurance arena will absolutely need to, whatever role we play in the insurance sector, or indeed other financial services, we will, all of us, have to think about climate. But insurance will not ultimately be able to deal with all of climate change unless we are successful in mitigation. I think that I'm trying to remember which reinsurance CEO, but one of them has said, essentially, in a 2-degree world, some things will become uninsurable. At higher temperatures, insurance may just become unfeasible altogether. So loss recovery is a key part of the picture, but not on its own.
Thanks for that. Antonio and David, and again, Jay, can you all speak to, what's happening in terms of climate change in the Caribbean in your sphere and your role in addressing it? So Antonio with coastal, David with UNDP and small grants program, and Jay with your research looking at agriculture and climate change. Antonio, you want to start?
Yeah, okay. Greetings all. Thank you for the opportunity. So in my little space, I'm actually a civil/coastal engineer. So from in the early 90s at the Coastal Zone Management Unit, we have been battling with those changes in the oceanographic space for forever. Now, in terms of adaptation, what has happened is that, and coastal engineering is probably the newest of the engineering. So we have been working with things like sea level rise and storms and statistical analysis of storms from creation. It's the only way we can get our work done, because in order to design properly in the coastal space, we have to take these things into consideration. Now, adaptation for us actually takes two forms. So we have the the one most people know when we build the coastal structures and shoreline or offshore, breakwaters, revetments, groins, or the boardwalk, which is really an assemblage of those different components. Or we've tried to deal with it proactively as well. So, and when I say that, I mean through proper development planning. And how we've managed to do that is that in Barbados, let me say that in Barbados, how our systems work right now, if you're developing in the coastal zone, that typically has to go through a process where it goes to the planning and development department, and those applications are referred to my unit for assessment on their impacts on the shoreline and the marine ecosystem. And through our analysis, the department has 3 sections: a marine section, a marine biology section, a planning section, and engineering section. We would analyze these developments and their impacts and try to provide recommendations whereby the development would impact minimally on the coastline. We don't want to destabilize the coastline. We don't want to reduce the resilience of the coastline. And so through that process, we have certain policies on how you should develop in the coastline. One of the major ones is how far you should be set back from what we call the high water mark, which is defined in a law when it is measured on what it is. And in that way, by stipulating setbacks on the south and west coast of 30 meters if possible, and setbacks on coastal cliffs based on the structural integrity of the cliffs and so on, you can see how you are building in resilience before the development is even put on the ground, by saying that you need to be set back a certain distance from the shoreline, which gives the shoreline then an opportunity to reduce the impacts naturally, because the beach width, healthier corals, so you don't want to impact the corals. These natural ecosystems will protect the shoreline and the properties from erosion and structural impacts. Then you have the one that we say is like that goes after reactive. I don't think you were reactive, but it is one where you come out the situation and the perils have already begun. Erosion is being on the site, and you have to look at how you can make the shoreline more resilient. So the boardwalk is the example most people know in Barbados, but I don't know if most people know it is that. People just think it's a boardwalk, but it is actually a structure that was built to make the shoreline resilient. Because prior to its construction along that shoreline, there was a lot of overtopping and structural impacts. When Ivan passed, there was a lot of structural damage and so on. So in terms of that kind of engineering reactive structure, that is designed with climate change considerations. It has to be designed with climate change considerations because coastal hazards are one of the few hazards that literally have the whole climate variability, climate change impact built right into it. So we deal directly with sea level rise. There are some other areas where you don't have to deal with that. We have to deal with sea level rise. And because most of the coastal hazards are caused by climate, hurricanes, storms, long period waves from swells, we have to have a handle on how those things are changing over time. And therefore, as part of the whole design process for our coastal structures, we undertake a statistical analysis of these storms. And we use return periods rather than categories for our designs. In Barbados right now, we use the 1 in 50 return period. And throughout the course of time, whenever we have been called upon to do this work, it is a statistical analysis of all storms up until the time that we are able to do our work. And therefore, we can capture any climate variability like that. I'm going to pause there because the 2 other people need to speak. Don't want to go on too long. Give it somebody a chance. So we can come back later if you have any questions.
We will. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yes. Good afternoon to everyone, to the panel, to Mrs. Spurlum. Excellent job in terms of convening this discussion. I think that the CAA is really leading by example. And I would like to point out that when we speak about the relationship between climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation in the Caribbean, you would see that there has been an evolution, and there's a difference between when we speak about it at the global level as opposed to speaking of it at the regional or national level. But let me put it in context based on the conversation that we had earlier in the question that you asked. Within the context of the Caribbean, our work had focused initially, if we go back 10 years, 12, 13 years, very much on building frameworks within the region to ensure that they can engage in climate change mitigation. And the thing is that in the early stages, when we look at climate change mitigation and adaptation, both were on the table. And many countries had a keen interest in going towards mitigation, not because that was the critical or the main area in which we needed to work on, but because it had other social and economic implications. Because we are very energy insecure in the Caribbean, and therefore, if you engage in climate change mitigation, you address energy security. In addition, the cost of doing business in Barbados and the Caribbean is very high. The main contributor to that is the cost of energy. Again, if you do climate change mitigation, you address that factor. In addition to that, it also addressed a question of enfranchisement. Then people could actually be enfranchised and own part of the energy. Therefore, you're enfranchising the average citizen to be a part of saving foreign exchange and generating foreign exchange. So governments across the region had a very strong incentive to go towards climate change mitigation. In STEPS UNDP, what we do, we are convener, we help with policy development, we also help with piloting. So if you look at the team of UNDP, initially a lot of our work was in terms of lending governments the technical expertise that they would need to create the policy and regulatory environment that can facilitate the transition that they needed to clean energy to a low carbon economy and towards the green economy. So we worked very heavily in that space. Now, I must say that it didn't take long for a business case to be clearly established in relation to climate change mitigation. So we saw results far faster in many countries, for instance, Barbados. In no time, once we had the policy framework correct and regulatory environment correct, it flourished. We also saw the same thing in Jamaica. Those countries in the region that are lagging behind is because they still need work on their policy and regulatory environment. But the business case itself has been established, and that's why you see there's a big uptake in renewable energies and renewables within the region. In fact, in some countries, for example, Barbados, the speed at which we've moved, the grid has not been able to keep up with it, right? If we bring it down to the level of the community, where my program works, the Just Small Grants program, where we take community action with a global impact, we have to demonstrate to civil society and to the average citizen that climate change mitigation could work and is profitable. And we were able to do that through small pilots in various countries around the region. And that was successful in then mobilizing larger projects, also creating the frameworks where you can buy space on roofs. So private entities can buy space on roofs. We piloted that initiative so they understand how it works, and there's a framework for that. For example, the Subsidies Foundation, they now generate $100,000 in revenue per year based on renewable energy on their roofs. So it shows you that climate change mitigation could be a sustainable financing mechanism for social work and social entrepreneurship. So that's on the side of mitigation. However, there's a different story when we look at adaptation in the region. Now, at a global level, 7% of the climate financing generally goes to adaptation, which is very, very low. When you look in the Caribbean, it's more around like 38% goes towards adaptation and 48% goes towards climate change mitigation. Because the governments in the region recognize that adaptation is extremely important for us. And that's why the work that Mr. Roy is doing exemplifies the vision of Caribbean leaders and how important adaptation is to us. And we would have put more focus on that. So if we go to the Paris Agreement and we look at Article 3, where you speak about the nationally determined contributions, where each country decided, well, look, this is my contribution, you would see that most developed countries focus very heavily in their determined contributions on mitigation. And our colleague here on the panel, Ms. Kennedy, was very clear that she thinks that developed countries should do much more in terms of mitigation and lead by example. And that's reflected in terms of the larger contributions, national determined contributions in developed countries. But when you take the microscope and you look at small island developing states, you would find that their nationally determined contributions are actually filled with adaptation. So there's a lot of adaptation there, but most of them don't have the financing mechanism to achieve that adaptation. And that's why you have the Article 8 that speaks about loss and damage. And we would have worked on that. I was in Spain, in Madrid, when we worked on that. Dr. Hugh Seeley as well continued to work, who's now late, Dr. Hugh Seeley. And then fortunately, just last year, while at COP in Egypt, we now have the loss and damage fund established. And that brings us showing that the work has continued, and the Caribbean is not at a position where climate change mitigation has the framework for many countries, but there's a lack of business case for adaptation, and there's also a lack of financing, but that's where we need it most.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
And Jay, thank you. Jay, you want to talk about your area?
I'm going to approach this from another angle. I'm sorry, I've been looking at the chat. So I'm going to approach this from another angle.
Questions in there. I'm going to get to them.
Great questions.
I'm going to play an advocate, and not for the right side just now. I'm going to put on a hat. I'm going to put on a hat, and I notice the touting of solar, and I notice the talk of policies. But there is a paper that is about to be published that I authored that looked at the existing framework for disposal of those panels after their commercial viability. It's non-existent.
And that's another discussion as well.
So we are mitigating, but given the vast amount of panels that exist, we're mitigating ourselves. The title of the paper is Going Green to Pollute. So at the end of the life cycle, are we recycling the panels? In some instances, given what the panels are made from, you do not want to stack too many of them in one area because it may lead to toxicity. So we're talking about mitigation, but in a climate sense. But that sustainable process then at the end of it needs a policy to ensure that it remains sustainable. So forgive me for coming from that end. So that's one. Two, for the region, we are experiencing on average, and this is taken from a study from Stevenson et al., 22 more warm days since 1960. And that means, and we've seen fewer cold nights as well. So Jamaicans have this term that they call Christmas breeze. So in around October or November, you feel this nice little chill, and it indicates you're approaching that Christmas period. Now, if you ask people over the last 5 years or so if they felt that, they all tell you they felt that in January. All right, that indicates a shift. Jamaica, Kingston is also poised as to be one of those I think it's in the top 3 cities in the world that is expected to experience a climate departure. If you want a simple frame in which you put that climate departure, a simple frame in which you put it is, just imagine every year you face in the future, even at its coolest, it's going to be warmer than every year you faced before. And when we think about that in context, there are those who might say to you that, so what, we're already warm. I saw somebody here mention the high-rise structures we have, the concrete structures, the way in which we built, right? I was a part of another webinar, and this was somebody who was looking at the built environment, and they did a quick analysis of the difference between an area that's shaded and an area that is just a concrete structure. The difference was 15 degrees. Now, in essence, if you have shade, any bit of greenery, it lowers that temperature. Now, can you imagine pushing that into the night? Remember, different things have different albedos, different retention, different specific heat. So they retain heat for different periods of time. So the sun might not be there, but you still feel hot. And in order to give yourself some respite, you need to, dip into your pocket and press that button on the AC to get yourself some cooling. And so we are putting ourselves in this cycle. And I think nowhere is this cycle more felt and more greatly felt than within the region. And still wearing that hat and coming back to the wonderful, I like the boardwalk, but historically we build with a context of what has happened before. Climate change makes what has happened before your old story and makes what you've not seen or yet to experience your impending normal. So even if you build with that old story in mind, climate change will say to you, guess again and come again. And the best case we have, and I like saying this, if a snake bites my neighbor, I too am in danger, is that we can consider the first coining of the word Medicaid and look at the mere fact that a country got 6 months of rainfall in a single night. Devastating dams, devastating a port city. It's never happened before. And so with climate change in mind, with mitigation there, with adaptation there, should we only be planning from the past or using the future to plan what we do now? And with that, I hand over to you.
Well, definitely we should be using the future to plan, and I hope that some of the studies that you're doing are going to give us some insight into how we can translate some of those modeling scenarios into actions on the ground. I wanted to chat with Aisling a bit. I wanted to comment on something I saw in the chat, which is Guyana with its new oil discovery. Don't think they would be thinking green. I'm not going to call out the name of the person who put that in the chat. But we were talking about this, Aisling, and just talking about biodiversity, which is the area that you're heavily involved in now. Guyana is actually looking at carbon credits. So tell us a little bit about biodiversity, what you're doing, and how that intersects with climate change.
Yeah, so many interesting themes coming up in the chat, and there's a couple of points that Jay has made that I'd like to pick up on as well, and I'll start there if I may, and then maybe circle around. So absolutely, and to all of the points you made, and they intersect, and obviously I will commend the IEA paper on climate change adaptation to you. You know, you've got two of the authors here because Bertha was also one of the authors. We talk quite a bit in that about the challenge of cooling cities, and the need to think about different ways of organizing urban environments to offset the impact of urban heat. And we also talk about maladaptation. Air conditioning is a really good example of maladaptation, because as Jay has pointed out, you get this vicious circle. As we get warmer, we use more air conditioning, which puts more greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So, and a lot of people can't afford air conditioning as well. I just, sitting here in Ireland, we sometimes wish we were a little bit warmer. It's we don't really get a lot of heat, but there's too warm, which Jay has also pointed to. Like, as of today, 30% of the world's population is sometimes exposed to deadly heat stress. That is going to increase to between 50 and 75% by the end of the century. And if you look at some of the heat records that have been broken this year, and I know we're in the El Nino cycle, which is exacerbating that, they are temperatures that the human body will not be able to sustain if they are outdoors. So much needs to change. The other point I wanted to make, to emphasize that Jay picked up on, because again, it's a theme that we look at in the paper, is we will no longer be able to rely on the past to deal with the future, because Antonio mentioned return periods. Events that may have happened once in 50 years in the past will now happen maybe 5 times in 50 years. So the extremes will become more common. And it's not only that they will become more common, but that we have less insight into what's going to happen in the future. There is more uncertainty to allow for. And if we're building for, we expect buildings to last for X number of years into the future, we need to plan not only for what's predicted as the most likely trajectory of climate stress, on our building materials, on the weather environment that those buildings are going to have to encounter. But we also need to allow for the confidence intervals and the uncertainty around that expected trajectory. But to come back to your question about Guyana, yeah, I mean, I have two topics I've been spending a bit of time on over the recent months for my local actuarial body here. One was biodiversity, and the other was actually carbon credits. Because, you know, one of the ways at the kind of organizational level that that organizations seek to mitigate is to buy carbon credits to offset their emissions, and that is a whole complex area in and of itself. I mean, I think, you know, essentially the issue is that globally we need no more new fossil fuel extraction. So there are already enough, you know, fossil fuel extraction sites to more than exhaust the remaining carbon budget we have for the world to stay within any reasonable temperature increase, certainly to stay within any chance of meeting the Paris Agreement. So we should not be opening up any new oil fields. But we come back to the issue that we've already discussed is, you know, what is equitable around the world. And I think that's, you know, these are really, really, really difficult issues to address. I don't have any answers. What I do have is a note of caution around the idea, and I know this has been part of the Guyana story, is that you can extract the fossil fuels and then offset the impact of that with trees. We need the trees, but we also need to limit the fossil fuel extraction. So we need to find a way to kind of equitably share what fossil fuel extraction we do in the remaining years before we stop extracting fossil fuels altogether.
Go ahead, Jay. I thought you were going to ask them. So, what is our solution?
I'm actually going to. There is this dichotomy that we have, and it's how do we develop without polluting, and how do we strike that balance of doing development and still advancing without making it a pricey advance. So there is that telling question. We spoke about temperature increases and the stress it could have on human bodies. But there are other aspects of our overall development and ecosystems that get challenged as well. Take, for example, under heat stress, did you know cows produce less milk? So there was a study that actually looked at putting cows in an acid environment to see if that would actually improve milk production. And it did, because as the cows respire, they give off the water. The water is not available to produce milk anymore. A similar study was done for chickens. So how does heat affect chickens? And when chickens are young hatchlings, they're very temperature sensitive. And so in essence, you have larger farms who have cooling houses that can actually accommodate, but a small farmer cannot. And in essence as well, and if you push the envelope a little bit, we could put ourselves to the point of actually using science a little bit to inform policy, or science to drive the decisions we make. So do we have a blanket approach? And somebody asks, how can actuarial science help? In essence, you could literally parameterize farming. So there are crop varieties that are geared towards particular regimes. Let's say if something is drought tolerant, and we can project 6 months in advance whether or not we're going to get above normal rainfall or below normal rainfall, then it could be the case that you, in setting up, I'm not an actuary, let me make that very plain. If I say anything wrong, please to correct me. All right. So let's say it's going to be a below normal, which means you're getting less than normal rainfall. If farmers plant a particular variety, it could be the case that their premium level is a little bit lower. If they choose to plant another variety, their premium level could be a little bit higher, and payout could be a little less if something happens to devastate their crop. So there is a marrying between that. And if there is and what it seems to happen in the region is there's a financial incentive, then policies seem to gain hold and traction. I'm not sure if it's my optics and my look at it or my perspective, but if there is monetary value or monetary gain to be had by doing something, it seems to take hold within the region. So I think that within that setting, it lends itself to, there is greater benefit for me if I do this. And that is something that then would be informed by science. The crop varieties could be paired towards what the climate is. And so when you make your projections or you make your forecasts, you're then saying, given this forecast, this variety within this crop is going to be working best. And you can actually marry that with the soil conditions. And so for each planting season, if you do that, you build resilience, you build security, because there are tools and there are software, there is techniques that exist before even planting the crop. We can project what yield is going to be like. We can say how much water the crop is going to need. And if we can do all of that already, why can't we parameterize that for insurance? Look at the varieties, look at the yields that could be had. I'm not saying what the payout is. Remember, I'm not an actuary. So I leave that part of it to you.
With your permission, Bertha, I would like to add to that. Perfect. Now,
Okay.
within the region, we are quite sensitive with how we release data. And when I say we, those people who hold data, and I know many governments hold very sensitive data. And sometimes the reluctance comes because that reluctance would come from the perspective that if we release that data to particularly insurance companies, it may have a significant impact negatively on insurance premiums. And because insurance is very high already in the Caribbean, some persons holding that data may be even more reluctant to release it. But if it were at all possible to use that data in a way that it would, instead of becoming a stick, it could be a carrot. I think actuaries are the key to ensuring that it is designed in such a manner. So therefore, if you're building a hotel and it addresses the key risk parameters, especially related to climate change, then you can have a reduction in your premium based on some actuarial analysis. And so we do have the data in the region to do that, but it's having a commitment that that data could be available to do so, and that the policy will be set up in a way that it would be a carrot and not a stick, because I don't think having more expensive premiums really answer to our situation. But I think it's having the premiums crafted in a way, looking at behavioral economics so it can shift and shape the behavior of persons who have those resources to invest. And remember that the problem is essentially a private sector issue, because governments in the regions, they have been investing in adaptation, but they're severely constrained. The private sector, they have the resources to invest, but they're going to invest where it makes sense, where there's a business case. And so actuaries have the ability to address this business case by attacking some of the main issues that would make the business case not really appealing to a business investor. So I'll leave it there, but I think that's the crux of the issue.
Yes, so now I can jump in with permission because Mr. David got to speak and say something he wanted to mention. So I'll just follow on from there, because for the longest time, I remember we did a study years ago through a CPAT looking at inundation, different levels of inundation on the coast. And we had all these nice maps showing how far in the water would, to use Bajan terms, come in on the coast, on the south and west coast in particular, where a lot of our critical infrastructure was sited. And I remember I had to go to give a presentation, and some insurance companies came in to have a seat. And I was told, well, maybe you need to not give that presentation showing people's houses under attack from water and inundation. And me being an applied scientist, I hadn't even studied insurance. I was trying to tell people, look, this is what is expected. And you have to be careful when giving presentations with model outputs as well. The scientists in here know that, because it is a model output. It is not real life information. It is you have some information, you put it into a model and some equations, spit out an answer. And so from then, the reluctance that Mr. Bueno was talking about came into play in terms of it wasn't say it's adversarial, but we had this reluctance around the insurance community in putting out. I remember when the hoteliers on the West Coast was like, no. If you show that map, they won't insure me at all. So that was the kind of thinking that they had at the time. Fast forward to now, what we have done in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years is moved integrated coastal zone management into a place where we do vulnerability assessments and hazard assessments and get into the area of risk. It's a tough area though. We don't have that area is a very highly skilled area. You need to have certain competencies to understand that at its fullest. I believe some of the actuaries with their high level mathematics have a better understanding than us. But the point is that what we have done out of all these studies is that we've actually created a platform called the National Coastal Risk Information Planning Platform, NCRIP for the acronym, and it sought to not just stop at the point where you're showing what the inundation is and where those lines are. It looked at exposure as well as vulnerability, but we also had the other thing we had this time though was the actual values of the properties and so on that we were investigating. Anyway, to make a long story short, the insurance companies and the actual world and so on, they can be your friend. We realize now that, you know what, we have information now that we can have a conversation, I want to say, whereby, yes, what Mr. Bueno has said, if you as a coastal property invest in adaptation, protection, ensure that you're building resilience in your area, how does that translate to premiums in terms of, do they reduce? Do they stay the same? And how maybe by speaking to the insurance people, explaining what we done on our side, how that could be an incentive in terms of double incentive actually. On one side, the person who actually looking to protect their property is an incentive for them to do that because possibly there may be a reduction in insurance. Because half the time you're trying to get people to invest in adaptation or stretches, you know, the thing is, oh, all this money, we paying out all this money. Coastal adaptation in particular is extremely expensive. You know, you're asking, you're saying to them, you want to build the hotel, sorry, you can't put it so close to the sea where you want to put it. What is the merit then in them setting it back with this high water mark, and what are the incentives for that? Can they go to the insurance company and say, well, look, I have built-in resilience. Can there be a consideration for reduction in claims and so on? So it's a conversation that we really want to have as a coastal zone management unit at the appropriate time, because with government you have to go to your proper channels. But to have that discussion, because we think that is one of the ways that we can that can assist us in bringing people around to proper coastal development. And very quickly, there's a point I think Ashling and Jay was making earlier on this whole situation about mitigation and adaptation. One of the spaces where those two things kind of have a link is actually in the coastal zone. Now, the coral reefs in particular, they are one of the, I'm not a marine biologist, if there are any insight here, that Dublin's actuary, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but coral reefs actually sequester a lot of carbon. They're one of the biggest, in fact, healthy coral reefs that we had all around the world, they're one of the biggest sequesters. So from a mitigation standpoint, they have that service. From an adaptation standpoint, though, they also act as natural protections to the shoreline from storm waves. The things that we build as engineers, breakwaters, the reefs are natural breakwaters. So they have a number of services. The problem is that with the with the water temperature so warm, the coral reefs are stressed. And for a country like Barbados in particular, when we're a coral island, our beaches are made from coral. Sand is coral, actually comes from the coral reefs, from their degradation, from mechanical weathering and so on and so on, and grazing of the reef fish and the sea eggs and so on. So if it is that the coral health is bad, they can't sequester carbon, but they also cannot protect the beaches. And there also is a reduction in their production of sand to make beaches, which then reduces the beaches' width and its ability to protect the shoreline. So while I said at the beginning, we focus on adaptation, there is a mitigative part of our work, which is where we try to look at coral reef health and try to protect them when we're doing our adaptive work, because we know that they also have if they're healthy, they provide a mitigated service. So in terms of trying to use renewables to get away from using the fossil fuels, but then as you can see in the chat and different things, you're still using the fossil fuels in an attempt to use renewables. We have charging ports for electric cars that typically use fossil fuels, electricity. I had often wondered if there was a way to make those charging ports use solar energy. There's a wondering now with these car batteries, the same electric car batteries, when they're finished, where they're supposed to go? Up to the dump? Which is similar question to the solar panels. So we trying our best to get into the renewable energy space, but we still got to deal with some consequences of doing that as well. I know that the energy sector and the energy division and Ministry of Energy looking at offshore renewable energy now, offshore wind farms, offshore. I think they're looking at wave as well. But again, what are we going to do when some of these wind farms, and they're colossal structures, as you know, they have to be replaced? It's always what we're going to do with the parts and when they're actually, not in use anymore. So it's an interesting discussion here. I have to, go around and around with it till, we come to a proper solution.
It sounds like no matter which area we use, whether we use fossil fuels or we try renewables, there's going to be some sort of pollution or some issue that we have to deal with. I guess what we need to decide is which is better, which area can we go down without causing too much harm.
Yeah, balancing the trade-offs, essentially.
Exactly, to our environment. Interesting. Ashley, you want to say something? I saw you taking notes there.
Yes,
I did want to ask one of the questions that was in the chat after that.
Yeah, and just very, very quickly, I think that's where there's an intersection between climate and biodiversity. So, just to give you one overall statistic, about half of global GDP is dependent in some way on nature, which we don't really factor in, because we're not charged for it. We're not, we don't get a bill for the coral reefs or, any of the other ecosystem services. So we absolutely need now to think about how we protect nature and our natural capital. And there's a real synergy between that and addressing the climate crisis. I could talk for another hour on that topic.
Very quickly, but before you send the question, just to quickly say that is why there's this big thrust towards natural capital evaluation. So they're trying to now look at valuing systems, coral reefs, mangroves. It's a tough task because they provide multiple services, but that's the next place they're going to go, because that has to actually be factored into your national budgeting. Yeah? That's
another one of my areas in terms of, as an environmental economist, that's one of my specialties, valuing environmental resources. And exactly why we have the problem is because we have not internalized those ecosystem services. what we call positive externalities, right? They're there, and therefore there's market failure. We have less of them. We're getting less of that service than we should because there's market failure. If we evaluate appropriately and we incorporate it within the market, we'll find that we'll have more ecosystem services. A good example of that is in the UK with organic agriculture. When they started to pay farmers for organic agriculture, you found that there was a large increase in acreage. And I was actually able to do the research and prove that it actually impacted positively on the water resource quality throughout England. So these things have a relationship. We need to understand them. And that's why actuaries are our biggest friends, because we need to run the numbers, but we need to work together because the solution cannot be one person working in silos, the applied scientists on one side, the economists on one side, scientists. We need everybody working together, break those silos and solve the real problems, because solutions to one, as His Excellency Ban Ki-moon said while he was the UN Secretary General, have to be solutions to all. And that's the final place where I could probably say happy UN Day, because we forgot to mention that.
It is UN Day, that's correct. That's correct.
Yes.
But I want to tackle this question very quickly. And it says, what are some of the insurable events which would no longer be insurable at 2 degrees? Now, Antonio, I don't know if any of your studies looked at what would happen in Barbados if the temperature increased by 2 degrees. So I guess if we have any idea, or if there have been studies around the world, or if there have been studies in the Caribbean specifically, is there a feeling that insurers will put some events as no longer being insurable?
I think that's already happening in some parts of the world, Bertha. And you know, whatever example you take, you know, is always going to be sort of location specific. But I think in parts of the US, in California and Florida, we're already seeing insurers pull out of markets now. It's not always just climate change. You know, sometimes it's regulatory factors as well. If I look at the UK, you know, not all properties can get flood insurance. So, you know, insurers are not, they operate within the private sector unless, you know, they are collaborating with government on specific schemes. So it will happen at less than 2 degrees in some places, maybe at more than 2 degrees in others. It really is context specific. But we will start to see insurance market failure more and more as climate change gets more extreme, which is why we need to mitigate and mitigate and mitigate, but also why, as David has said, we need to work in a multidisciplinary way. And, you know, public-private partnerships is also something we mention in our paper, because neither sector can solve these problems alone. It needs a partnership approach.
Thank you. And Jay, you're going to comment on?
I was going to ask the person who asked that question a question in return. When do they think the world will hit 2 degrees? That in essence kind of frames the question. The Caribbean is advocating for 1.5. The Caribbean has looked at what the difference means between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And it's not a uniform change across, as small as the Caribbean is, it's not a uniform change across the Caribbean, which means it would not be a uniform change across the globe. And ironically, that, as much as it seems like 0.5 degree of a difference, that difference is the difference between a 30% drop in annual totals in rainfall and an increase in rainfall. So that gives you the scope of what we're looking at as being between a 1.5 and a 2 degree. And so it's difficult to tell. Because at 1.5, it could simply mean that one country is so dry that there's no need for flood insurance anymore. You will never be flooded, because it could also mean you're just so wet that I can't give you flood insurance because every time it rains, there's going to be flooding. So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of scenario. And so we need to be very careful and very specific about how we go forward with this. As we say, in some instances, these are models, and we treat these models as everything is equally possible. But if all the models are pointing you in a direction, it gives you some confidence with that model. So if you're using 10 models and they're all pointing you towards increase, it gives you some confidence, especially if they're representing your situation in different ways and different aspects, and they're coming to the same point, we tend to say that. So we have to be careful. Also, there are some telling things that we must take note of. One, when we face a harsh season, it's hard to tie that one season to climate change. However, when we look at the long-term pattern of it, we can start getting some of those scenes. And the thought I'd like to leave everybody with is this. If I could do one thing, no matter how small it is, to push the agenda of mitigation and adaptation ahead, what would it be?
Thank you. And thanks for that, Jay. Thanks to all of you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We could be here for another hour easily discussing this
more
topic.
than that. Yeah, much more than that.
You all have such interesting perspectives on this problem. And I want to thank you all, and the audience, of course, for participating. We thought we'd get to many more questions, but I hope that we've tackled some of the areas that you're interested in and that you have some answers and some direction. It sounds from listening to all of you that actuaries can become involved, more specifically, Antonio, in the studies that you've been doing. And of course, Jay, when you talk about using science to model future scenarios and for us to determine what the insurance premium reduction would be in those cases. So thank you again for attending, and thank you to the audience for participating. And last but not least, I want to thank everyone behind the scenes who made sure that this webinar would happen. If we wouldn't be here without you. So thanks everyone, and
Ms. Moderator, certainly you're not limited to just one webinar. So,
exactly.
Clearly, you can
if there's interest,
just to make sure you get any questions and so on. So thanks, but thanks for having me. Everybody have a good evening, afternoon, night, morning, in between. Take care. Please be safe.